Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative, where we're trying to bring awareness to the recent publication of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read public inquiry, the report and the recommendations, because they have wonderful research backing, great information, and practical steps for how we can move from today's practice to tomorrow's, where we're reaching more students and allowing more children to become successful readers the first time they are taught. Today, I have the pleasure of Una Malcolm joining me from Ontario. Thank you for joining me today, Una.
Why don't you start
by telling people a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So first off, thank you for having me. I always joke that I can talk at length about reading to anybody who will listen. So I'm glad you volunteered to be that person. I am an Ontario certified teacher. I'm an interventionist. I'm a structured literacy interventionist. So I use structured literacy privately with children. I am also a doctoral student in reading science at Mount St. Joseph University, and that's been a tremendous opportunity to really dig into some of the research backing a lot of the content that we're talking about now with the Right to Read inquiry. I have particularly been leaning into thinking about screening and assessment because I think we're doing a great job at talking about how instruction can be optimized and how we can make sure we're basing our instruction off of the relevant research. But we know that that instruction is at its best when it's informed by assessment, when we're able to have instruction that is informed by data to best meet children's needs. So that's something that I've been really leaning into, and I'm so excited to chat with you about it tonight.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about screening, and I hope today that we're able to dispel a lot of those and help teachers understand how it's not just another standardized test that you're making your students sit through and the marks are going, being recorded and then forgotten about. Screening informs instruction, and it makes it so you know exactly what your students need instead of guessing. And these little guys are brilliant at disguising things and fitting in, and whether it's masking with quietness or developing different compensatory strategies when they're doing the reading with you with books they're familiar with, this quick screening opportunity that you spend with them really highlights areas, or has the potential to highlight areas that you need to address with them.
Absolutely. It's something where I agree. There are plenty of misconceptions about screening. And I will just say right off the top, we would never want screening to be a compliance activity. It's not something, it's not something that we want, we would want to say, okay, check, done. Let's put it in the filing cabinet and we'll pull it out in another couple months. The goal of screening would certainly be to generate data that we can use to teach. And I think another big misconception is sort of what a screener actually is. And I think that makes it a little bit tricky to conceptualize. I mean, we know that was one of the major recommendations from the OHRC. In terms of children in Ontario need to be screened. Their recommendation was twice per year. They need to be screened in order to inform instruction and in order to trigger early intervention. But I think that there are some misconceptions in terms of what actually is screening and what tools would we use for that and what type of information would we generate. When I think about screening, I think, universal screening, it's all in the name. We want to screen every child. That way, every child has voice. That screening process gives every child a voice. And we're less likely to miss students, like you mentioned, who can fall through the cracks and have that difficulty be exacerbated over time. So when we think about screening, we want it to be fast so we can do it with everybody. We want it to be relatively inexpensive so we can do it with everybody as well. And we want those screeners to be reliable and valid and not to go too far afield into some of the psychometric properties of them. But that really allows us to trust the information, right? We want to trust the data that they generate. And then we also want to make sure that these screeners allow allow us to predict who is going to be okay down the road and who needs additional support to reach that point of being okay. And I think that was one of when I really leaned into that, and when I recognized the predictive power of screeners, that really helped me sort of say, okay, whoa, we know with children in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, quite early on into their reading careers, we can predict with a reliable, valid screening tool, we can predict who's going to be reaching that criterion, who's going to be doing okay down the future. So we have the head start to change instruction to allow that child to thrive.
Yeah, and that's so important. And understanding that we don't want school districts or schools to take the time to create their own screening tool. And this is something that I'm hearing in a lot of districts where they're trying to create something and reinvent the wheel. And yes, you can take the concepts and the ideas and create your own, but the amount of time, money, trial and error that's put into these assessments is really worth spending that money on the protocol or the ability to enroll students in that assessment series, because it gives you the predictive power. It tells you what you can do, and it gives you that diagnostic information, not meaning a diagnosis. We're not saying we're diagnosing students with a specific learning disability like dyslexia at this period or this point in time. We're using this to say, hey, guess what? Here's a red flag, but you know what? If we do this, this, and this, we can help the student now and remove that flag, hopefully, and ideally. And we've seen research from around the world showing us that when this is done, we're able to make it so fewer students struggle with reading.
Absolutely. I agree with so much of what you just said. Number one, it is a conversation now that's popping up in terms of what should we include in our screener. And I think, when again, if we think about those criteria for what we would want when we're selecting a screener, we want it fast and inexpensive. We want it reliable and valid. And that's something where that takes a ton of data, and it takes a ton of research and a ton of expertise, frankly, to be able to actually calculate that and to figure out how reliable are these measures? Are they valid? Are they measuring what we want them to measure? I think especially about that predictive power. And I think about, where many screeners that are currently in use, they have a benchmark score. And that benchmark score is not some arbitrary number where we say, okay, we want kindergartners to be able to segment 12 sounds in 1 minute or whatever that is. That's not some arbitrary number. It's a number that actually was generated from research in terms of saying, okay, here are skilled readers in grade 4. Let's backtrack and sort of see, okay, these readers who were strong readers, what was their performance like in kindergarten, with the idea that we want all children to reach that point so they have an 80 to 90% chance of being skilled readers in the future. And I think just the nature of that type of predictive power and the statistical analysis that goes into that makes it really difficult for a board or a district to be able to DIY a screener to have that degree of reliability and validity and predictiveness. But it's something where that is a conversation. But I would hesitate, just knowing that there are a lot of really good, solid, rigorous screeners out there that are often free, or even if they're not free, are very low cost. There's a low barrier to entry for these screeners. And it's something that I do hope that that's something that continues to be a conversation topic for boards in terms of really looking into what exists on the market and what could be implemented in a doable way in their system.
Definitely. And you're saying that it's, when we're looking at these measures, they're taking data from students in grade 4 who are strong readers. So even if a district were to create this on their own, they'd need to wait at least 5 years before they could actually take the data that they've collected and do anything with it. And the amount of statistics and retest, like it's a huge costly process. And a comment that I do hear as well, that's, a different population, but learning to read the English language is consistent around the world. So while there may be some issues with pronunciation or what the demographics were of the sample population, the skills that we need students to develop are the same. And the expectations are the same. I know when Dr. Nadine Gabb spoke regarding the OHRC report, she was recommending that districts or ministries, like in the Canadian perspective, we have ministries of education for each province and territory. And if they were to say, okay, we've looked at the screeners available, and these are the ones that we feel are acceptable to use within our area. So it's not saying you have to use this one and only this one. We come up with a few that the school can select based on their population in their school, or even on a teacher by teacher basis. Personally, I feel it's better for a school to adopt a screening measure that they use consistently across the school, because then you can have the tracking of the data. And that's what's great about these programs, is that it will track the student as they go along and see how they're making and the progress that they're making, and alter the recommendations for the student.
Absolutely. It's something where when we think about screeners, my assessment training has really highlighted that the purpose of assessment is to answer questions. The type of question that we have would change which assessment tool that we have, or which assessment tool we would choose. If we think really broadly and super, simply about the types of questions we might ask, we might say, who needs help? What should that help be? And is that help working? And if we think about those kinds of questions, screening really tackles that first one, who needs help? A more diagnostic assessment to figure out which exact letter sounds does the child needs instruction on, or, do we need to work on segmenting an initial blend? That would be a diagnostic assessment that we wouldn't necessarily do with every child. We would do with a child where we have a question about and we're not sure what to teach next. And then that idea of progress monitoring being something to say, is this support that we're giving, is this working? But I think one of the really critical things to think about for screening, and this does really fit into that RTI MTSS model, is that idea that we can judge risk for a child, but then we can also take a look at risk for a system in terms of looking at, I'm thinking of a teacher who I'm working with, and she's able to look at her screening data and to say, oh my goodness, my grade 3s, 80% of them are struggling with fluency. That's an indicator where at that systems level, at that class-wide level, we need to think not necessarily about small group intervention or individual withdrawal with those students. We need to think about differentiating and optimizing that classroom instruction to best meet the needs. So we're not, the great thing about screening is we can look at the individual child, but then we can also look at where they fit in the system as a whole and how to optimize that for even more efficiency.
Well, and as you collect data over the years, if you see these trends happening, it allows the school to make sure that there's the appropriate professional development in place to let the let the teachers build the skills that they need to help address these areas with their students.
Absolutely. It's something where having that information across a class, a grade level, across a school, across a board, really allows for more targeted PD. It allows for leadership and problem solving structures where interventions can be tried and that can be monitored. It allows for more nuance and it allows for more specific instruction to meet the specific needs of whatever scale that is being examined. Again, it can go as granular as an individual child, thinking about an individual child level problem solving team where we're trying to figure out, okay, what supports and what interventions can we put in place for this child, but then also thinking about how that could be scaled on a much bigger scale to address many more students. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the next question that you often hear is time. How much time does this take? Because there are so many demands on teachers, and it's adding like one more thing to what they need. But really, when you look at it in practice, and once you get an understanding of how to do it efficiently, and how to use the data, you're going to be saving yourself time in the long run.
Absolutely.
Now, these assessments typically, depending on grade level, but they're typically one-on-one. And, it can be done depending on the measure that you do in as little as, a few minutes, 5 minutes a student. So if you have a class of 30, that's going to be a little over 2 hours of instructional time if you personally are doing it. And I believe that it's best if the classroom teacher is able to do it, because you get to see and learn so much about your student when you're asking them to do these activities that they aren't doing, one-on-one with you otherwise. And it gets you to know their learning style and where they struggle so well. And as you understand more about the concepts and what you're looking at, it can really help you understand these students' needs.
Absolutely. It's something where, as you mentioned, it does depend on the grade level, because one of the key aspects of screening is that the skills that we screen for really depend at what point the child is in the development of reading. Screening for a grade 3 looks very different than screening for an SK. So it does depend on where they are in terms of which grade level, because we might tap different skills at different times. For example, a kindergarten child, we would probably want to look, depending on the measure, we would probably wanting to look at something segmentation fluency. We might want to look at decoding fluency. As children get older, we're leaning more on that oral reading fluency, ORF. So that does change. But the comments I get from teachers is that once they wrap their mind around what exactly we're asking children to do, and once they get a couple under their belt, they're often finding that it's much, much faster than doing a running record, knowing that with a running record, it can be really tricky to time, because we're having to sometimes test ahead and test back to find that instructional level for the child. So knowing that for the most part, many of the screening tests are 1 minute each. If we think that many of them, since they have that word fluency in the name for many of them, phoneme segmentation fluency, nonsense word fluency, oral reading fluency, it's a timed measure where there's a very specific cutoff, and they're quite brief. So it is something, the feedback I get from teachers is that once they just get into it, it usually is more efficient, and it is a time saver, especially compared to some of the more lengthy running record implementations where teachers are having to go back and forth to find the appropriate text level.
Definitely. And once you get used to it, or once you've done it a few times, you do really get on a roll and you understand. Now, these are standardized. And what that means is it is scripted and you do have expectations. So in the 5 minutes that you're spending with this child 2 or 3 times a year, you're not trying to teach them. And some teachers struggle with wanting to give them feedback, but it's very scripted on these things, what you're allowed to say. And that's to make sure that you're getting the honest representation of the student's skills. And do you know what? As soon as you notice that weakness, that doesn't mean that the next 20 minutes you can't go and say, hey, you know what? I know you were struggling with this. Let's take, a few minutes to go through that. There's nothing wrong with that. But in that 5 minutes that you're doing the screening, the point is to get that honest representation of the student's current skills.
Absolutely. And standardization is so important. I think about, especially if we're thinking about a beginning, middle, and end of year screening process where we're wanting to see how children are doing moving through a school year or across multiple school years, it's really important that we're using the exact same instructions, the exact same discontinue points, the exact same modeling, the exact same feedback from time to time, so we can actually judge, is this difference in scores due to a difference in student ability, or is this just because we're measuring it in a different way? And truthfully, that is something where, it does sometimes take a little bit of getting used to for teachers. It's a different thing to deliver than to give a DRA or to give a GB Plus or something like that. It is a bit different, but it is very structured. It's very laid out. It's very straightforward. And oftentimes these screeners have really quite comprehensive administration manuals and also really solid training options as well, in terms of whether in many cases, it's an asynchronous workshop. So it is something where that standardization really is critical. So again, we think about that idea of reliability and validity. We need to be able to trust this information and to be able to trust that it was collected with fidelity and that we can interpret it knowing that everything was standardized.
and it's really important that as a teacher, you take the time to get and understand the measure before you start doing it with the class. You don't just pick up the box, grab the kit, sit down and start with the student. You want to have that opportunity to learn and try and understand what's going through the test. I mean, you shouldn't struggle with any of the words on the test that are real words, but when you're looking at pseudo words, you want to make sure that you're familiar with them. I know one of the tests that I've used quite frequently is the Woodcock-Johnson. And in their word attack, they have a word that is querpostonius. And, you know, the first couple times you look at it, you may not be able to say it fluently. And we're looking for fluent pronunciation of these words. So you need to make sure you're familiar with it. And it's not you sitting there trying to figure out what it's supposed to sound like at the same time that your student is.
Absolutely. It's something we talk, I sort of draw parallels between this and between instruction. We talk so much about the power of teacher knowledge and teacher training in terms of an understanding of reading development, an understanding of language and language structures to support literacy. We know, and we talk a lot about how important that is. I think it's equally important to have a good, solid understanding of what a measure is trying to measure, how to deliver it, and how to interpret it. Especially when, you know, oral reading fluency is a really critical for most assessments, that's sort of mid-grade 1 and up, depending on the specific one. But that's something that screeners really lean on because it's such a cheap, fast, easy way to really glean a lot of information about a reader and what support needs to happen for that reader. But it can look a lot like a running record. And sometimes, you know, people will jump in and say, oh, okay, I got this. I know exactly what to do, because it looks a lot like a running record. But there are some really critical key differences that do sort of require that, you know, familiarization in administering, in scoring, and in interpreting the data. That really is, it does sort of take a little bit more legwork just to get started, even though it does look a bit like a running record.
Yeah, and it does take a little bit of practice. So don't just do it once, like, oh, I'm never doing that again. It was so much fun. I like record the scores and time and this and that. It does take practice. The first time you do it, it's going to be a little bit awkward, maybe a little bit of hectic if you're not used to doing it. But it's one of those things that takes a little bit of time, but it is worth it in the end, especially depending on the screener that you use. It will print out a very nice report with charts and everything and say, okay, these are the students that you need to pull out to work on this. And here are some activities that you can do with them to support that. And so it's making your workload less and you're helping your students more.
And it's something where I think about, you know, we're at a point in the year where, you know, teachers are sort of saying, okay, you know, what do I focus on for this year? What do I focus on for next year? I think it's absolutely worth considering having a soft place to land to trial out some assessments, you know, with the remainder of the school year, knowing it will still help teachers support the students that they have now, but also knowing that that's a bit of a gentle ramp up towards maybe doing class-wide screening in September. Sort of thinking about, okay, this is not something I wouldn't say, okay, you know, let's just think about it, you know, Labor Day weekend and just say, okay, let's go and let's figure, no, right? You know, that maybe for some eager beavers, that might be doable, but I know that I would feel really overwhelmed trying to figure it all out and then implement it on Tuesday after Labor Day. But I think about, you know, the power of the timing that we're in now. There is time for sort of a bit of a slow burn in terms of let's dip our toes into this. Let's see if we can learn a little bit more about how this might differ from how we've been assessing in the past, or maybe how we could use screener data to build small groups for reading, for small group reading instruction, as opposed to using reading levels. How are we going to get this data? And then what could we do differently with it? How could we use it to inform our instruction more? Again, knowing that this is not something that this is just a compliance check mark and to put it in the drawer. This is something where this allows for stronger instruction for every child, our high flyers and our students who need more support.
Definitely. And one thing that I found interesting over the years when I'm working with students, you have these students that are really good at reading or appear to be really good at reading, but they're using a lot of memorization and they don't have the same understanding of the sound structure of language. And while this is fine in the lower grades, it can turn out to be a problem as they get older. So identifying it now, doing those activities to build those skills in phonemic and phonological awareness, it's the time where then they can do it with the class, with their peers, and make the progress that they need.
Absolutely. And I think about how quick and easy it is to catch that type of a pattern where it's a child where, it seems like they're reading, especially if they're reading a predictable text, we're going to the park. I'll bring a backpack. I'll bring my sunscreen. I'll bring whatever. Especially if they're reading a predictable text where they can really lean on verbal skills and context and pictures, they can seem okay. But when I think about many of the screeners, I use Acadians personally. And when I think about how fast it is to spot that type of a profile where that child will go on to struggle with a 1 minute nonsense word fluency test, for me, that is 1 minute that it's invaluable. It really quickly flags students where they are using those compensatory strategies to get by, and it allows for earlier intervention when the gap is much smaller. And it also, to be fair, saves that child a whole lot of frustration and heartache as they move through the school years, as they move through year after year as a struggling reader. We know how difficult that is for kids, for teachers, for families. It's devastating. If we can catch children earlier with really brief, really easy tasks that are sensitive to these different trajectories, oh my goodness, I just think about how much that could save and how much that could really support children.
Definitely. Now, something that we talked about, or you've mentioned briefly, is running records. And I want to take a moment now to discuss what a running record is, what the point of it is. And a lot of teachers are familiar with them. They're quite prevalent across North America and abroad, but it's different than screening. So
absolutely,
give us a quick elevator speech about running records.
So you're absolutely right, because often, when I'm chatting with teachers, sometimes they'll say, okay, this is what screening is, and these are the type of measures we might use, and we would want to do this 2 to 3 times a year. And they say, okay, so where does DRA fit, or where does Fountas BAS fit, or where does XYZ, whatever the running record is that school or that board uses, where does that fit? And when we think of running records, we think about a series of leveled text where children are moving through and are, teachers are finding their instructional level, their independent level, their, accuracy is being calculated, fluency, depending on the measure. Fluency might be measured as words correct per minute, but it also just might be judged with a rubric in terms of, commenting on prosody or in terms of expression. So it can look a lot like an oral reading fluency assessment, because we've got a notebook and we're recording student errors as they read orally. But the difference really is how these data are collected and how they're interpreted. So some of the problems, if we think about those key criteria where we'd want to choose a screener, we want it to be fast and inexpensive. And in that respect, many running records, the cost effective, fine. Running records can be slow because oftentimes we're trying to move through and trying to find, okay, is this child reading at a G? Is this child reading at an H? Is this child? It can take some time. We also want to think about running records. We also want to think about screeners, in terms of being reliable and valid. Are we measuring what we want to measure? Can we trust these results? Many of the screeners that are commercially available actually publish a technical manual on their website. And if you want to geek out, go for it, because there's, 100 pages of all the statistics that go into exactly how these tests are being constructed. And that's something that doesn't tend to be available for running records. But for me, I think the biggest piece that makes me shy away from a running record would be the level of prediction. We know that reading profiles are developed early and they're unfortunately quite stable. We know that even in grade 1, the difference between our strong readers in grade 1 and our weak readers in grade 1 is small, but that it just amplifies over time. So we need to be able to effectively catch who those strong students are and who those weak students are to give everybody what they need. Now, there's some really interesting research, mostly done on the Funtis and Pinnell benchmark assessment system, but there's some really interesting research in terms of diving in terms of how strong is that measure in terms of predicting how students will read down the road. There's a really interesting paper that found that the benchmark, the Funtis and Pinnell BAS, was 54% predictive of whether a child would be a strong reader or a weak reader in the future. And for me, I think, gosh, I mean, we may as well flip a coin and save that instructional time and devote it to actually reading instruction. So the challenge with running records, ignoring, some of the psychometric properties with them and ignoring that they can take forever to actually administer, they don't really give us the information we need. And it's not always specific information to key literacy skills, such as phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding, fluency. We're not predicting kids who they're going to have trouble down the road, and we're not really grabbing that important information that we need to actually teach, to do something about it. It's challenging. It's challenging because that I hear from teachers often they are required to submit running record scores and to submit reading levels to their board. It is something where it's a complicated issue, and I do hope that some guidance or policy comes down from my context in Ontario. I do hope that is going to be changed, but it is challenging because running records are very widespread, but they might not be the best tool that we would want to use for these purposes.
Definitely. Now let's switch over to talking about screening at the different grade levels, because a kindergarten screener looks different from a grade 3 screener or a grade 2 screener because the skills that we're looking at. And you can actually even start assessing children at 4 years old. And, remember, we're not screening to diagnose, we're screening to identify risk. And you can notice those struggles with the sounds within the English language very early. And in some children, you see the issues showing up in those preschool years, and getting that support early, getting the improvement and supporting them, allowing them to catch up to their peers before they even have to learn the alphabet in the classroom is really advantageous for everyone. And it's still very playful at that age, and they're enjoying it and playing with the sounds of language.
Absolutely. It's something that when I think about the Ontario Human Rights Commission report, and I think about those 5 key areas that many of the recommendations were organized around, screening was one of them. But then also I see the links between screening and several of the other areas. I think about how, they made recommendations specific to reading intervention. With a strong screening program, fewer children are going to be needing intervention because we're able to provide that within the classroom. We're able to provide that, again, like you mentioned, in a fun, playful way, playing with the sounds of language, linking them to print and integrating those with reading and spelling. Having a strong screening framework allows for fewer children who down the road need really intensive intervention, which really frees up those precious resources. We know resources are finite. There's never enough time. There's never enough money. That's universal. But if we can reduce the number of children who need intervention, that allows for a more intensive program and more intensive support for those children who really do need intensity. I think especially, some of the recommendations were related to professional assessments and access to speech language, access to psychoeducational assessments. Again, how many children are needing a psychoeducational assessment in grade 3, 4, 5, 6 for weak reading, where a 5-minute screener in kindergarten could have saved a lot of heartache and a lot of difficulty. Certainly there are recommendations across the board in terms of some major overhauls that there's some big work that can happen in Ontario, that's for sure, and across Canada by, no doubt. But I see the power in early screening linking to several of those key topics to allow us to use our resources more effectively.
Definitely. And that's key, because we do, while up front it may be more work understanding everything, it is down the line going to make it so you have more success with your students. You see the result, and the glitter or the glow, that thing that you see when they finally get it and when it makes sense, and the pride that just shines out of them. And you're not going to see that hurt, that pain, that retreat for the students that don't. Now, when we have children entering kindergarten, in Ontario you have junior kindergarten, but other places there isn't, and it's not necessarily mandatory for students in Canada or children to attend kindergarten. So doing that early screening at the beginning of the year in kindergarten and grade 1 really can give you a lot of information about where the child is at compared to their peers, because everybody has a different experience before coming to school, with the amount of print exposure, the language that they've been exposed to, and the concepts. And so if we can identify those areas early, it's very beneficial. And yes, once they get in the routine of school, they may absorb a lot of this stuff naturally, but there's nothing wrong with helping support it along the way until then.
Absolutely. And it's something, certainly thinking about the power of a really strong assessment system in terms of monitoring response to instruction. It absolutely, I think about students at the beginning of junior kindergarten, at the beginning of whatever their first year of formal schooling is. We can't control any of their early experiences. However, if we have our finger on what's going on for each of these children, that can be incredibly powerful. And knowing within the screening process that we're monitoring them over the year, that allows us to see, okay, we could have a child where, maybe they haven't had as much language exposure, or maybe their print, whatever that is, we'll be able to see if we have children who are taking off when they're in that responsive environment that is providing evidence-based tier 1 instruction. I think about, I have screening booklets here, right, where I'm tracking students across the year, and we're able to judge, how is this child responding? And if they are, great, keep on going. And if they're not, what do we need to do? I think it's really important to view a reading difficulty in terms of the instructional context, and not in terms of something that's the inherent fault of a child. Children don't want to have difficulty with reading. It's something, students don't own reading problems. Reading problems are an interaction between who the child is and the instructional context. We can't change the child's context. We can't change the child's profile. We absolutely can change the instructional context. That's something that's well within our power. And frankly, it's one of the most changeable features. So knowing how this child is moving through the school year allows us to actually know, okay, do we need to intensify? Do we need to change course? What do we need to do to allow this child to get everything that this child deserves? It's something where, again, focusing assessment allows us, screening allows us to fine tune that instructional context, the things that we can actually change.
Exactly. And at the beginning of that first year of formal instruction, if you're able to do the screener at the beginning, it doesn't mean you're providing intensive support. You're just establishing a baseline and seeing how they're progressing with the tier 1 or the whole class instruction. And then maybe a winter break or in December, once they've had a few months to figure out the routine and had that exposure, you're going to see, well, is that enough for them? Is that making enough of a difference? Are we seeing the growth that we can just be happy with them in the tier 1 or the whole class environment? Or do we need to make sure that we do provide that small group or tier 2 support to help them go further? And if it's something that is, pretty obvious that they're not getting it, well, then maybe they move on to that one-on-one support. The thing that I think it's important to mention when we're looking at a response to intervention or a MTSS model is that if you have a student with a whole bunch of red flags, and you know that they need more, you're not waiting. You should not be waiting. You can say, okay, look, I know this child needs support right away. And you can do more diagnostic screening. That's not a full psychoeducational assessment, but it's really identifying the areas that you need to dive in to provide the support, and look to the others within the school that can support you, because as a classroom teacher, it's not there to expect you to provide the intensive one-on-one instruction, because you just don't have enough hours in the day with your students to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point, to recognize that within RTI, response to intervention, within MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, there is no way to fail. With these frameworks, we're not requiring students to have a psych ed assessment to open the door to intervention. I think about how many children are, waiting on lists for psych eds for that to be the gatekeeper to intervention. And by the time that happens, the gap is colossal, and this child is often miserable and is really feeling all the hurt and all the pain of being a struggling reader in a typical classroom for however many years. There is no way to fail with MTSS. Students as early as kindergarten should be able to access as intensive instruction as tier 3 if they need it. But knowing that these frameworks are focused on building the base, I think a big misconception that often is flying about is that MTSS or RTI is an intervention program, or is something that is a top-down intervention focus. And that's absolutely not the case. We know that RTI, one of the biggest tenets is that we want to have a healthy, strong classroom tier 1 instructional context to allow the greatest number of children to become skilled readers, just with that low cost, broad research-based instruction for all. That way, whatever extra resources the school has, and I know that can be tricky and I know there's never enough, but whatever resources are available are saved for those children who really do have all kinds of red flags. It really is critical to recognize that we're thinking about building from the bottom up instead of from the top down.
Definitely. So let's look. Okay, so the first year of formal schooling, when we begin the reading instruction, what are those skills that we're looking at?
Absolutely. So if we're thinking about a child, I think about junior kindergarten, we would want to be looking at a wide variety of different skills. We'd probably be wanting to look at oral language, probably vocabulary, alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, printing, handwriting. Gives a really good a good indicator of, is there risk? As children sort of move through kindergarten and start looking into grade 1, we're maybe looking more specific into finer grained phonemic awareness. Is that something where, and again, this depends on what assessment tools, are in use, but thinking about as children move through, that might change from a first sound fluency to a phoneme segmentation fluency. As we know that we want children to be working more accurately and more reliably with the individual phonemes of language, that can give really clear indicators of risk. We're wanting to look at letter naming fluency. We might be wanting to look at nonsense word decoding fluency, again, thinking about those children where, they might be reading, I'm going to the zoo, I'll see a giraffe, I'll see an elephant, I'll see a whatever, but they can't decode the nonsense word MIP or something. That is a really clear-cut indicator, and again, can really quickly judge risk. So that sort of starts to come into play as we're thinking about kindergarten, as we're thinking about grade 1. And then as students start to, ideally have a pretty good handle on the orthographic code and are developing decoders, we can again shift a little bit more to thinking about text level reading. And we're looking again at that oral reading fluency, where we're looking at how accurate and how fluent are children as they're reading connected text. And we can use their accuracy percentage and we can use their words correct per minute really effectively and really efficiently to judge who's on track and who needs more support.
Yeah. And one thing to consider about these assessments is it's different than a psychoeducational assessment. We have a set number of items we're giving in a set amount of time. So in a psychoeducational assessment, when you're using the standardized measures that are more diagnostic, you're going to start the student and make sure they have a certain amount correct. And then you're going to stop at the top level that they are. But when we're screening, we're just saying, okay, well, if you reach this, like, amazing. But we're not going to keep testing to see if you're at a grade or 2 or 3 higher than you actually are, because while that's wonderful information, it's not going to change how that tier 1 support is going to be happening.
And that's something where, if we're thinking about enrichment, or if we're thinking about providing support to that top end, absolutely, we could go above and beyond. But if we think about really quickly, it is true, screening allows us to differentiate on both ends of the spectrum, if that's the route we're going. But again, we want to really quickly and effectively pick out who needs help. And then, we can follow that up with diagnostic assessments. What should that help be? And then if children are receiving additional support, is that support working? I just think about the power of having that screening to very quickly pick out who needs support. How can we quickly and reliably tease those children out of the crowd and get them what they need before it becomes a big problem?
Definitely. And when we do this, it allows us to see the progress too. So you're not only seeing how the child's doing, you're actually able to give yourself a pat on the back and say, you know what? I was able to change the trajectory of this child's education, because that's what you're doing. And you can see these in the reports, because if they're making those huge jumps from those interventions in the small group, or the one-on-one support that you're getting or giving them, it's really gratifying, and knowing that you're making a huge difference in this child's life. And then if you're noticing that they're not making enough of a difference, then you need to be a little bit critical of yourself, saying, okay, am I giving them the amount of time that they need in the support? And it may be the case that you're not, because you simply don't have enough hours in the day. And that's totally understandable.
Mm-hmm.
You only have so many hours with the kids, and you have a bunch of material to cover. So there are going to be times when you just don't have the hours to give the intervention, and you need to find a way to juggle to make it work. There's also going to be the situations where maybe you don't have a complete understanding on how best to support these students. And in that case, you can say, okay, yeah, I kind of understand, say, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, but I don't have that deeper understanding about the subtleties, and this student's really struggling in that area. So I need to seek out additional support, whether it's through a peer mentor or doing additional professional development. And that's where you can ask your school, your administrators for that additional support. And hopefully things are going to start becoming more available and accessible for teachers. And there are other groups. I know the Right to Read Initiative has a Facebook group that we're just getting started to hopefully provide that peer mentorship to help you gain those skills that you didn't get from your teacher education program. And that is one thing that I haven't highlighted in this conversation, but it is something to note. I know screening measures are not something that has typically in the past been discussed in the teacher education programs. So it's very important that if it's not something that was part of your teacher education program, realize we're not blaming you. It's not your fault that you don't know this, you haven't been taught this, but we need to make sure that you learn it, because it's a great skill to have in your toolbox, and it's going to allow you to make that much bigger change in your students' lives and to be that teacher that made the difference.
Well, absolutely. I was just about to say, I agreed with about 7 things you just said in there. Absolutely. We know that good instruction changes kids' lives. It really changes the lives of children, but it also changes the lives of the grownups who are attached to them too. It is tremendous in its scope and its power. And for me, assessment allows that to happen. Good screening, good assessment allows that to happen. It is something, I think about, the power of having a screening booklet where we can track a child across the school year. I think about this lovely little child who will remain nameless, and we've got beginning of year benchmarks, we've got middle year benchmarks, and we'll see where this child is in June, because we're putting a lot of support and instruction into this child. And then I think even about something like progress monitoring. I mean, I think about, again, right, we can track, we can numerically track a child's progress. And how great does it feel to see, oh my goodness, look at that child's phoneme segmentation just skyrocket with instruction, or look at how that child is so much more accurate when reading connected text, or look at how that child is fluent enough that they're now able to comprehend what they read. It's something where when I think about it, and I know it's a lot, because when I chat with teachers, it's a lot. And I think of how much we're asking them to change what they were trained and change everything they've been doing up to this point for instruction, not everything, but changing a fair amount for instruction. And we're unfortunately kind of asking them to do something similar for assessment. I think about a teacher who I'm working with, and a few years ago, she said, Una, I know you're really nice, but sometimes I wish I never met you because you're making me do it. I'm like, oh gosh, and I hear that. Absolutely. It's hard. And I especially think about, siloed teachers where they might be the only ones in their schools, and they might not have support from their administrators. They might not have support from their boards, and they're, using their own time and their own money to figure out training and to buy resources. And it's hard. But if I could give any takeaway at all, I would say just think about trying screening. Just think about trying screening. Dip your toes into it. There are a couple, right? There's the rest of this year, dip your toes into it and think about, maybe having a bit of a screening situation in September next year. I think number one, it allows for stronger instruction, right? It allows teachers to teach better. But then also, I think it builds a sense of urgency. There's initiative fatigue. We all know how many competing projects there are and just how difficult it is to navigate all the things that teachers need to navigate in the classroom and outside the classroom, especially nowadays. And I think it's hard to get really excited about changing instruction or systems-wide literacy reform if we don't know what the problem is and if we don't know how serious the problem is. So I think having screening data in terms of how are our kids doing in this class, in this grade level, in this school, allows for much more buy-in in terms of, okay, maybe we need to look at retooling our instruction to better support these children. And then thirdly, I think one of the main benefits to just dipping your toe into screening is that idea that you can see that your hard work is paying off. It's really clear to see student progress. And that validates teachers themselves to say, hey, look at this. That Una, I wish I never met you teacher is now doing progress monitoring with some of her struggling students and has seen tremendous growth. And talk about reinforcing, oh my goodness, all this hard work, all my own time, all my own money, all this, tricky stuff, it's working because my children are reading, my students are reading because of it. Screening and evidence-based data collection and analysis, it validates good teaching and it helps to bring other people to the party because other teachers notice and sort of recognize, oh, well, she's got something going on, right? There's such power in screening.
Definitely. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention is, can you hold up that protocol?
The progress monitoring or I've got two.
Yeah, the one with the 3 columns for the benchmarks.
Yes.
So if we look here, you can see that throughout the year, at the beginning of the year, you're looking at a certain set of skills, but then it changes throughout the year to reflect what we're expecting in instruction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So this would be a grade 1. So you can see beginning of grade 1, we're looking at, there's a bunch of acronyms, my apologies, and it's probably not super clear, but we're looking at letter naming fluency, we're looking at phoneme segmentation fluency, and we're looking at nonsense word fluency. As the school year progresses, now, if this were a struggling child, we would probably be progress monitoring here and we could add back in that phoneme segmentation fluency, but thinking by mid-year grade 1, we're wanting to focus more on oral reading fluency, we're looking at words correct, we're looking at accuracy levels, and we're looking at a certain point at retell and comprehension. So as the child moves through a grade level, moves across multiple grade levels, what we're measuring changes. Now, keeping in mind, again, if this was a child who's at risk, we're going to keep monitoring those lower skills because we want to make sure that we're teaching and remediating those and that those skills are solid.
Yeah, but we're not saying we have to measure the same skills in kindergarten as we do in grade 3. We realize that the expectations, and once they've mastered a skill, they've mastered a skill. So we don't need to go back and do it again because I'm like, look, I've done this. I know it. Let's move on.
Absolutely. And I think especially, a concern I have, phonemic awareness is critical. And absolutely, I would never disagree with the importance of teaching phonemic awareness. But that's not something where we need to screen every grade 3 with phonemic awareness, right? That's a pretty significant time investment that could be used much more efficiently. We're wanting to test backwards. If we're having a child where in grade 3, they're not reading, they're not understanding what they're reading, they're not reading fluently, they're not reading words accurately, of course, we want to see what's going on with their phonics, what's going on with the phonemic awareness. But if we're having a child who's reading accurately and fluently in grade 3 and is understanding what that child reads, we're not going to really dig into phonemic awareness because we know that that's an underpinning skill. That skill is likely there, which was what facilitated the skilled word reading and text reading to begin with.
Yeah. And that brings up another point that I just came to find, is that you may be in a school that may not be doing screening, but it doesn't matter what grade you are in. You can begin it, even though the rest of the school doesn't. You don't have the historical data, but that doesn't mean that starting it in grade 3 or in grade 2 isn't okay. You can start at whatever point that you are at and take that information and move forward. You can't change the past, but you can change the future.
Absolutely. Because that, again, thinking about why screening allows us to teach better. Screening allows us to build skill-based small groups. It allows us, if we're thinking about, even a teacher in the junior intermediate grades, knowing that, this student is going to have difficulty in, reading comprehension tasks or reading across the curriculum areas because they're not decoding accurately. That insight allows teachers to provide more differentiated, more individualized assessment or instruction, and it's not something that could be information from September of that school year. We don't necessarily. Is it great? Absolutely, it's great to have that information, but it's not necessary by any stretch.
Definitely. And it also means that at the end of the year, you can put, I know it's asking you to put extra time into things, but as teachers, most teachers are willing to go that extra mile for their students. And for those students that are still struggling at the end of the year, you can stick a little note in their file for their teacher next year and say, hey, look, this is what I've done. I know it's not something that you may be familiar with, but this is where we're at. And realize that these are the skills that this student is weak in. Hopefully they get support over the summer to improve them. But if they don't, be aware. Keep your eye out for this.
Absolutely. It gives that content. There's the option of continuity for a child where we're concerned about their progress, about their rate of progress, about their skill development. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now we do have a question that says, in a recent interview, Dr. Linda Siegel criticized standardized screeners that are timed. The Acadian screener, and not sure about the DIBELS, involves several time tests. Any thoughts about the value of timing in student performance?
Absolutely. So first off, I will say I haven't seen that interview, so I don't know what specific concerns Dr. Siegel had. So I can't speak to that. I do believe the DIBELS measures are timed as well. The Acadian's DIBELS situation it's very confusing, and it's not doing any favors, but essentially the idea that what is now Acadians is the original DIBELS, and what is now DIBELS is a new test under the name DIBELS. Now the rationale, and again, I don't know what Dr. Siegel's criticism was, and I'm happy to do some digging and to learn more about that, but the rationale for time test is that knowing that these skills, if we think about fluency, our end goal is comprehension. We know that we need a timed test to understand, are the text level reading skills accurate and automatic enough to actually support comprehension? Knowing that we want to be looking at accuracy, but then also automaticity. We need that measure of automaticity to know if those skills are automatic enough to support the higher level processing. We can see, certainly if we're looking at a child where we're watching them move through a test and we're saying, yes, you're accurate, but it's slow and effortful and it's not automatic and instantaneous, we know that that child is likely having difficulty getting through a text and comprehending what they're reading because so much of their cognitive resources is spent figuring out what actually is on the page. So again, I don't know her specific. I mean, I know there are sometimes some concerns that kids get worried or stressed out, or that, it's encouraged. Some people say that, it's encouraging students just to read really, really, really quickly. In my mind, there are ways around that when we've got time tests. It's how we frame it to children. It's how we set it up for them. But the rationale from, from in terms of timed measures is that we need to have that measure of automaticity as well as accuracy to support fluent reading and comprehension.
Definitely. And I think one of the advantage, or not advantage, but one of the facts about having a time test is you can say to the teacher, it's going to take you 5 minutes, right? Whereas where you don't have time test, and I'm not advocating that, yes, we should use time tests, and no, we shouldn't use untimed tests. I'm just looking at the logistics of it.
Absolutely.
And
I think it's something to think about, remembering that screening is not the only assessment that we actually do, right? Screening is broad. Screening is everybody. But if we're having, I think about a child who I'm progress monitoring. I think about how, we know from screening this child is struggling. We also need to know specifically, we need specific tools to inform what we're actually doing with this child. So that might be, is that the core phonics survey or something to figure out which specific letter patterns does this child need instruction on? Is this something like a blending and segmenting inventory where we want to know, okay, they can blend a CVC, but they're really struggling with a blend. I think about those assessments often being unstandardized, untimed, with the goal of directly informing that specific, what we're teaching tomorrow. So I think it's critical to think about, screening is one piece, but remember those 3 questions, right? Who's at risk? What should that support be? And is that support working? When we're talking about screening, we're talking about that first piece, who's at risk, and a little bit of what informs instruction. But again, we would want other tools and other pieces of the puzzle to make sure that we're really giving that child what they need.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today, Una. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Do you have any last thoughts that you think we should discuss?
No, I think we've covered a lot today. If there is any key takeaway, again, if there's any teacher a little hesitant, it seems uncomfortable. It seems uncomfortable the same way maybe teaching phonics or teaching phonemic awareness a different way would be. It's very similar. Consider dipping your toes into screening with that maybe idea of September having that at the beginning of the year, but dip your toes in. The water's warm. I promise it's doable. It seems tricky at the beginning, but it is phenomenal in terms of informing instruction.
Definitely. And on the replay and in the podcast notes, you will find ways that you can contact either Una or myself if you're looking for more information.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.